For loving her own blood, she was cursed, a forbidden bond whose echo would resonate for generations in the forgotten hollows of the Black Mountains. In eastern Kentucky's remote Appalachian wilderness, where ancient peaks cast long shadows across isolated valleys, whispered secrets of family lines too closely intertwined remained for nearly a century. This is the tragic tale of Eleanor Blackwood and the price her descendants would pay for choices made in ignorance, isolation, and perhaps misplaced love. The year was 1924. While America's cities roared with jazz and prosperity, the rhythms of life in the coal mining settlements of the Black Mountain Range remained unchanged for generations. Here, families like the Blackwoods lived by different rules forged by economic hardship, geographic isolation, and the fierce independence that characterized mountain communities. Nestled in a remote hollow sat the Blackwood homestead, accessible only by a treacherous dirt path that became impassable during spring floods and the winter months. For most of the year, the family lived entirely self-sufficient, rarely if ever seeing outsiders. Their nearest neighbors were cousins 3 miles down the hollow, and the closest town was Harland, nearly 15 miles of difficult terrain away. Like many mountain families, the Blackwoods had settled in these hills in the early 1800s. Originally of Scottish descent, they had maintained their bloodline for over a century almost exclusively within a small community of related settlers. A stern coal miner and occasional moonshiner, Eleanor's father, Josiah Blackwood, ruled his household with the iron discipline typical of the era. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Her mother, Martha, was actually Josiah's second cousin, a relationship that in communities where eligible partners were scarce and family connections valued above all, raised few eyebrows. What set the Blackwoods apart, according to records later uncovered by county officials in 1952, was the deliberate nature with which Josiah sought to keep the bloodline pure, historical documents would reveal. Josiah maintained a detailed family Bible that recorded generations of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, and in 2 cases, half-siblings who shared a father. Without formal education, Eleanor grew up, learning only to read from the family Bible and write her name. Like most mountain children, from an early age she worked alongside her parents, tending the vegetable garden, preserving food for winter, and helping care for her 5 younger siblings. 3 of those siblings displayed visible signs of what we now understand as genetic disorders. Jeremiah had a severe cleft palate and misshapen skull. Sarah was born with extra fingers and toes. And the youngest, Thomas, never developed speech beyond grunts and struggled with physical coordination. From Dr. William Harrison, who occasionally treated families in the region, historical accounts described seeing troubling deformities and mental deficiencies among certain isolated family groups. In his medical journals from 1927 to 1940, he noted, "The physical characteristics I observe in these mountain hollows cannot be attributed merely to poor nutrition or difficult living conditions. The pattern suggests hereditary complications arising from close family unions over successive generations." Dramatically, Eleanor's life changed in the winter of 1924 when her first cousin Samuel returned from serving in the Great War. Samuel was Josiah's brother's son but had been the rare family member to leave the hollow, having been drafted in 1917. His return brought strange new ideas and stories of the outside world that fascinated 18-year-old Eleanor. According to local accounts preserved in the Harland County Historical Society, an immediate bond formed between Eleanor and Samuel. Their connection was noticed by Josiah, who, rather than discouraging the relationship between first cousins, actively encouraged it, even announcing at church that spring that the two would be married by summer. What Josiah couldn't have anticipated was how Samuel's exposure to the wider world had changed him. While Samuel felt genuine affection for Eleanor, he had seen enough of life beyond Black Mountain to question the wisdom of marrying so close to his own bloodline. Torn between his feelings and his newfound awareness, Samuel faced an impossible choice. The weather that spring was unusually harsh, with late snow covering the mountain passes well into April. The isolation pressed upon Eleanor and Samuel, thrown together day after day in the cramped Blackwood cabin. As the dogwoods finally bloomed in May, witnesses later reported seeing the two walking the forest paths together deep in conversation, their expressions troubled. Court records from 1952 include testimony from Martha Blackwood's sister Ruth, who visited the family that spring. She described overhearing a heated argument between Samuel and Josiah about the upcoming marriage. Samuel tried to explain that marrying too close to your own kin creates sickly children, Ruth testified. Josiah wouldn't hear of it, saying, "Our family had always married this way, and it kept our bloodline strong." He called Samuel's ideas city nonsense and threatened to drive him from the hollow if he refused to marry Eleanor. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. According to Ruth's testimony and later corroborated by church records, the tragic turning point came in late May. One night, Samuel and Eleanor disappeared from the hollow, taking only a small bundle of possessions. They were found 3 days later by a search party led by Josiah. The young couple had attempted to cross Black Mountain to reach the railroad station in the next county, but a sudden storm had caused them to lose their way. Particularly brutal was the winter of 1925 in the Appalachian Mountains. Snow drifts piled high against the Blackwood cabin and temperatures plummeted to record lows. Inside, Eleanor struggled to care for her newborn twins, whom she named Samuel Jr. and Suddy. Precarious from the start was the infants' health. They cried constantly, struggled to nurse, and displayed troubling physical characteristics that even the isolated Blackwood family recognized as unusual. From his visit in June 1925, Dr. Harrison's medical journals provide a clinical but disturbing account. The male infant presents with severe cranial deformation, a pronounced overbite, and significant skeletal asymmetry. The female appears less affected physically, but displays concerning neurological symptoms, including seizure-like episodes and periods of unresponsiveness. Just 19 and still grieving Samuel, Eleanor became increasingly withdrawn. Martha Blackwood took primary responsibility for the infants, while Josiah maintained that their conditions would strengthen with time. According to Ruth's testimony, Josiah even suggested the twins' difficulties were a punishment for Samuel and Eleanor attempting to flee rather than a consequence of their close blood relation. Throughout 1925 and early 1926, the development of the Blackwood twins fell significantly behind normal milestones. By their first birthday, neither could sit unassisted. Samuel Jr.'s physical deformities became more pronounced as he grew. While Suddy developed what would now likely be diagnosed as severe intellectual disability, never learning to speak beyond a few guttural sounds. The fate of these children might have remained forever hidden in the remote hollow but for an unusual sequence of events beginning in the spring of 1926. The coal industry was booming and mining companies were pushing deeper into previously isolated areas. A new road was planned that would pass within a mile of the Blackwood homestead, potentially ending generations of isolation. Vehemently, Josiah opposed this development. County records show he filed multiple complaints and even threatened surveyors who attempted to assess the route. His resistance drew attention from county officials who became curious about the reclusive family that so desperately wanted to remain cut off. In April 1926, a social worker named Margaret Collins was dispatched to assess conditions in several remote hollows, including the Blackwoods. Her written report, preserved in county archives, describes her shock at what she found. The Blackwood household exists in a state of severe deprivation. 6 children share a single room, 2 of whom, twin infants of approximately 15 months, appear to suffer from significant physical and mental abnormalities consistent with hereditary complications. The mother, a young woman barely out of girlhood herself, exhibits signs of melancholia and neglects her own care entirely. Collins' report prompted a visit from Dr. Harrison, who had treated mountain families for years and understood their ways. His assessment was somber. The Blackwood twins represent perhaps the most severe case of hereditary defects I have encountered in my practice. I believe they are the result of multiple generations of consanguineous unions, culminating in the relationship between first cousins who themselves were the product of cousin marriages. Despite these concerns, the authorities of 1926 had limited powers to intervene in family matters, particularly in remote areas where local customs held stronger sway than distant government regulations. Dr. Harrison could only recommend better nutrition and basic care practices, which the family largely ignored. Unexpectedly from Eleanor herself came the turning point in the Blackwood story. In July 1926, she disappeared from the hollow, leaving her twins in Martha's care. 3 days later, she was found at the Presbyterian Mission in Harlem, 15 miles away, which she had reached on foot through difficult terrain. The mission director, Reverend Thomas Aldridge, recorded her arrival. "A young mountain woman appeared at our door today in a state of terrible distress, barefoot, and nearly delirious. She begged for help, not for herself, but for her children, whom she described as cursed by blood." Eleanor's desperate journey and cryptic words sparked concern in Reverend Aldridge. Reverend Aldridge, along with a local doctor and county sheriff, made the journey to the Blackwood Hollow. What they discovered would eventually lead to one of the earliest documented interventions in a case of generational consanguinity in Appalachia. The twins, now 18 months old, were found in a severely neglected condition. Samuel Jr. could barely hold up his misshapen head, and Suddy lay curled in a near-fetal position, responding to neither sound nor touch. The other Blackwood children showed varying degrees of developmental issues, though none as severe as the twins. Josiah resisted all attempts at intervention, threatening the officials with a shotgun. Only the sheriff's presence prevented violence. Martha, however, seemed relieved by the intrusion, later telling Reverend Aldridge that she had prayed for years for someone to help the children. County records indicate that the twins were removed from the home and placed in the care of the Harland Presbyterian Mission Hospital, one of the few facilities in eastern Kentucky equipped to handle severe medical cases. Eleanor, refusing to return to the Hollow, was given a position as a Laris at the mission. Grim was the medical assessment of the twins. Samuel Jr. survived only another 6 months, succumbing to pneumonia complicated by his numerous physical ailments in January 1927. Suddy lived longer, remaining in institutional care until her death in 1941 at age 16, having never developed beyond the capabilities of a young infant. The documentation it created was the most significant consequence of this intervention. For perhaps the first time in Appalachia, medical professionals systematically recorded the effects of multigenerational consanity. Dr. Harrison, in collaboration with a researcher from the University of Kentucky, published a paper in 1930 titled Hereditary Consequences in Isolated Mountain Communities, using the Blackwood case with names changed as his primary example. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained at the mission, eventually learning to read and write properly. Letters preserved in the mission archives reveal her growing understanding of why her children suffered. "I know now what caused my baby's afflictions," she wrote to Reverend Aldridge in 1932. "Samuel tried to tell me the danger of marrying kin token, but I didn't understand then. Now I carry this knowledge like a stone in my heart." For Josiah and the remaining Blackwood family, the loss of Eleanor and the twins marked a turning point. County records show that in 1928, when the new road finally reached within a mile of their hollow, Josiah refused to use it, maintaining his isolation by choice rather than necessity. The other Blackwood children gradually drifted away as they came of age, most seeking work in coal mines or marrying into neighboring communities. By 1935, only Josiah and Martha remained in the hollow, with their bloodline's continuation, at least in the isolated manner Josiah had envisioned, effectively ended. When Josiah died in 1941, Martha finally left the hollow to live with her sister Ruth, bringing with her the family Bible with its detailed record of inner marriage that would later become critical evidence in understanding the family's tragic history. Eleanor never returned to Black Mountain. Mission records show she eventually married a widowed farmer in 1937 and moved to central Kentucky, where she became an advocate for rural education. She kept her past largely secret, though she was known to warn young people cryptically about the dangers of loving too close. The legacy of the Blackwood family might have remained buried in county archives and forgotten medical journals if not for what happened next. A discovery that would bring renewed attention to the dark shadow cast by generations of blood bonds too tightly drawn. If you felt the chill of recognition while listening to the story, perhaps you've encountered families with similar histories in your own community. Share your thoughts by commenting. Blood ties can become blood chains. Your voice helps bring these hidden histories into the light where they can finally be understood. In the autumn of 1952, almost 3 decades after the Blackwood twins were removed from the hollow, a young anthropologist named Dr. Catherine Reynolds began researching Appalachian family structures for her doctoral dissertation at Columbia University. Her interest led her to Harland County, Kentucky, where locals still whispered about certain hollows and certain families best avoided. Unexpectedly, Reynolds' academic pursuit intersected with a public health initiative. The newly established Centers for Disease Control had launched a study of isolated rural communities where unusual disease patterns and congenital conditions appeared with troubling frequency. Black Mountain and surrounding areas were identified as regions of interest. What brought these parallel investigations to the Blackwood case was a remarkable coincidence, wrote Reynolds in her 1954 dissertation. While reviewing county health records, I encountered a notation about a family Bible with extensive consanguinity documentation held in the county records office. This Bible had been surrendered by Martha Blackwood before her death in 1949 with the explicit request that it be preserved as a warning to future generations. Now housed in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, the Blackwood Bible contains family records dating back to 1803. What makes it extraordinary is the meticulous notation of family relationships alongside marriage records. Lines connect cousins, uncles, and nieces, and in some cases, half-siblings. Next to many entries are notations about children born from these unions, including cryptic references to afflictions and early passings. Dr. Reynolds partnered with Dr. James Thornton, a geneticist with the CDC, to analyze the Blackwood family history. Together, they constructed what was then the most comprehensive family tree, demonstrating the effects of multigenerational consanguinity ever documented in America. Their findings were sobering. The Blackwood lineage showed progressively worsening health outcomes with each generation of consanguineous unions. By the time of Eleanor and Samuel's children, the family had experienced 7 generations of cousin marriages with occasional unions even closer. The twins represented a genetic tragedy almost mathematically inevitable. Revolutionary for 1952, Dr. Thornton's analysis identified patterns consistent with numerous recessive genetic disorders becoming expressed due to identical genes inherited from both parents. His report states the Blackwood case represents a textbook example of why outbreeding is essential for human populations. The accumulated genetic load in this lineage combined with the first cousin relationship of the final generation's parents created conditions where healthy development became virtually impossible. Reynolds and Thornton tracked down surviving members of the extended Blackwood family, including Eleanor herself, who was then living in Lexington. Now in her mid-40s, Eleanor had become an avid reader of scientific literature and understood more about genetics than many college graduates of the era. Her interview with Reynolds, recorded and transcribed, provides some of the most poignant insights into the human cost of the Blackwood story. "I dream of them still," Eleanor told Reynolds, speaking of her twins. "In my dreams, they're healthy, running through mountain meadows. But then I wake and remember Samuel knew. He tried to tell me what would happen if we had children. That's why he wanted us to leave, not just to escape my father, but to spare any children we might have. When I understood that years later, I nearly took my own life from the grief." Eleanor had remarried in 1937 to a man with no relation to the Blackwood lineage. They had 3 healthy children, all of whom were aware of their maternal family history and the importance of genetic diversity. Eleanor had become an informal educator on the subject, particularly after the science of genetics became better understood following World War II. Reynolds and Thornton expanded their investigation to other isolated hollows in the region. They discovered several family groups with similar patterns, though few with documentation as extensive as the Blackwoods. Their research contributed significantly to medical understanding of genetic disorders in isolated populations and helped shape public health approaches to rural Appalachia. The publication of their findings in medical journals in 1954 coincided with increased national attention on Appalachia. The region, long isolated and often misunderstood by mainstream America, was beginning to be recognized for its complex challenges, including health disparities that stemmed from both environmental factors and in some cases genetic isolation. But the Blackwood story also revealed how quickly circumstances could change. By the 1950s, the hollow where generations had lived in near-complete isolation was accessible by road. Television brought outside influences to even remote cabins. Young people increasingly left for education or employment in cities. The conditions that had enabled generations of continuity were rapidly disappearing. During this period, A difficult decision was made by Eleanor. With Reynolds' help, she wrote a detailed account of her family history, the twins' suffering and the scientific explanation for their conditions. This document, titled simply A Warning from the Hollow, was published in several regional newspapers and eventually included in educational materials about genetic health distributed throughout rural Kentucky. I share this painful story not to bring shame to my family name, Eleanor wrote, but in hopes that other young people might be spared the heartbreak I've known. What happened in our hollow wasn't evil or sinful. It was ignorance of nature's design. We now have the knowledge to prevent such suffering if only we heed what science tells us about blood ties drawn to close. Remarkable for the time was Eleanor's courage in sharing her story publicly when genetic disorders were often hidden away as family secrets or sources of shame. Her advocacy work, though largely confined to eastern Kentucky, represented an early example of genetic education reaching beyond the medical community to those who needed the information most. Beyond medical circles extended the impact of Eleanor's testimony and the Reynolds-Thornton study. In 1955, county education officials developed a simple but effective genetic health unit for rural high schools, explaining in accessible language why certain marriage practices carried severe risks. Church leaders, traditionally reluctant to involve themselves in marriage choices, began to counsel young people about the importance of expanding family connections beyond close relatives. Yet, even as these changes took hold, another chapter in the Blackwood story was about to unfold. One that would reveal how the consequences of past choices can resurface generations later, and how the shadow of Black Mountain would reach into places and times far removed from the isolated hollow where it began. As America entered the 1960s, the Blackwood case gradually faded from public memory. Dr. Reynolds completed her dissertation and moved on to other research while Dr. Thornton continued his work with the CDC, occasionally using the Blackwood family tree in presentations about genetic disorders. Eleanor, now in her 50s, had largely retreated from her advocacy work, focusing instead on her grandchildren and community involvement in Lexington. The original Blackwood Hollow stood empty, the cabin slowly reclaimed by the forest. Coal mining had expanded across Black Mountain, but the particular ridge where the family had maintained their isolation for generations was deemed too remote for profitable extraction. Nature began the slow process of erasing human habitation. However, the genetic legacy of the Blackwood lineage continued in ways both expected and surprising. Rapidly during this period advanced the scientific understanding of heredity, with researchers identifying specific genes and mutations responsible for thousands of conditions. What had been documented only as afflictions in the Blackwood Bible could now be named, understood, and in some cases tested for. In 1967, a young doctor named Robert Collins was completing his residency in pediatric medicine in Cincinnati, Ohio. Among his patients was a 4-year-old boy with multiple congenital anomalies that puzzled the medical team. The child's symptoms included facial asymmetry, skeletal malformations, and developmental delays. What made the case particularly interesting was that neither parent showed any signs of genetic issues nor reported any family history of similar conditions. Dr. Collins, who had studied under one of Dr. Thornton's colleagues, recognized patterns similar to cases documented in isolated Appalachian communities. When he inquired about family history, the child's mother, Patricia, initially insisted there was nothing unusual in her background. Her family had lived in Cincinnati for 2 generations, and her husband's family came from Pennsylvania. Persistent questioning, however, revealed that Patricia's grandmother had come from eastern Kentucky. With this clue, Collins began to piece together a remarkable connection. Hospital records confirmed that Patricia's grandmother's maiden name had been Blackwood. She was Martha's niece, who had left the Hollow in 1932 to work in Cincinnati. Though she had married outside her family line, she carried genetic variations from generations of consanguinity. These genetic factors remained recessive and unexpressed for 2 generations until Patricia married a man who by sheer coincidence carried a similar recessive trait. Neither knew they were carriers, but their son inherited the same variant from both parents, resulting in the expression of a condition that had seemingly disappeared from the family. Dr. Collins documented this case in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1968, titling his paper Genetic Echoes: The Re-Emergence of Recessive Traits in Urban Populations with Appalachian Ancestry. The article renewed interest in the original Blackwood study and highlighted how genetic factors could remain hidden for generations before manifesting in unexpected contexts. For Patricia and her family, the discovery was life-altering. Finding out that my son's condition connected back to relatives I'd never even heard of was overwhelming, she told Collins. My grandmother never spoke about her family in Kentucky. Now I understand why she was trying to escape that legacy. Patricia's experience was not unique. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, medical geneticists identified several cases where conditions associated with Appalachian consanguinity appeared in families that had been geographically and socially removed from those communities for generations. These cases demonstrated how the consequences of isolated breeding practices could extend far beyond the original families and locations. Meanwhile, Eleanor Blackwood Johnson, having taken her second husband's surname, continued to live quietly in Lexington. In 1975, at age 69, she was contacted by researchers from the University of Kentucky, who were conducting a longitudinal study on families affected by genetic disorders. Eleanor agreed to participate, providing blood samples that, with the emerging DNA technology of the era, allowed scientists to begin identifying specific genetic markers in the Blackwood lineage. In 1983, Eleanor passed away, never knowing the full scientific understanding that would eventually come from her family's tragic history. Her obituary in the Lexington Herald made no mention of the Blackwood case, noting only that she had been a passionate advocate for rural education and health. The most significant development in the Blackwood story came in 1985 when the Kentucky Department for Public Health established the Appalachian Genetic Education Project, AG. This initiative, inspired in part by the long-term impact of the Blackwood case, aimed to provide genetic counseling and education to communities throughout eastern Kentucky. Dr. Margaret Thornton, daughter of the original CDC researcher and a genetic counselor herself, led the project. My father's work with the Blackwood family shaped my understanding of how important genetic education is, she explained at the program's launch. What happened in those mountain hollows decades ago still affects families today, often without them even knowing the connection. AEP counselors traveled to remote communities offering testing, education, and family history assessments. They encountered significant resistance at first. Many mountain residents viewed genetic discussions as invasive or shameful. The breakthrough came when counselors shifted their approach, framing genetic health as part of the region's broader public health needs rather than focusing specifically on consanguinity. By the early 1990s, AG had compiled an anonymous database of genetic patterns throughout Appalachia, identifying regional hotspots where certain recessive disorders appeared with unusual frequency. These patterns almost invariably corresponded with historically isolated communities, confirming the long-term impact of limited genetic exchange. In 1992, the project published Genetic Heritage and Health in Appalachia, a comprehensive study that included the Blackwood case as its historical foundation. The publication coincided with advances in genetic testing that made carrier screening accessible to more families. For the first time, individuals with Appalachian ancestry could determine if they carried genetic variations that might pose risks for their children. Patricia's son, now an adult himself, became an advocate for genetic testing. Understanding my connection to the Blackwood family helped me make sense of my condition. He explained in a 1995 interview, "It wasn't random bad luck. It was the result of specific historical circumstances that shaped my genetic inheritance generations before I was born." As the 21st century approached, the scientific understanding of the Blackwood case continued to evolve. DNA sequencing technologies allowed researchers to identify specific mutations present in the family line and track their distribution among descendants scattered across America. What emerged was a genetic map showing how an isolated mountain family's choices in the 19th and early 20th centuries created ripples that extended into the present day. Yet, even as science advanced, human stories remained at the heart of the Blackwood legacy in rural communities throughout Appalachia. The curse of kin marriage, as it was sometimes called, became part of educational curriculum and community knowledge, not as a source of shame, but as a historical lesson about the importance of genetic diversity. The final chapter of the Blackwood story would bring the narrative full circle, back to the hollow where it began, and reveal how a community transformed tragedy into understanding and ultimately healing. In the spring of 2002, nearly 8 decades after Eleanor fled with her cousin Samuel, a group of hikers traversing the Black Mountain Ridge stumbled upon the remains of the Blackwood homestead. Little remained beyond stone foundations and a collapsed chimney, the forest having reclaimed most signs of human habitation. The hikers, students from Eastern Kentucky University's anthropology department, recognized the potential historical significance of the site and reported their finding to their professor, Dr. James Carter. Carter, familiar with the Blackwood case through his research on Appalachian communities, organized a proper archaeological assessment of the site. What began as a simple documentation project evolved into one of the most comprehensive studies of an isolated mountain homestead ever conducted in the region. The Blackwood site offers a unique opportunity to understand the material conditions of extreme isolation. Carter wrote in his initial research proposal, "Beyond its significance to genetic history, this homestead represents a way of life that has completely vanished from Appalachia, one where geography created the conditions for both cultural and genetic insularity." The excavation revealed details about the Blackwood family that had never been recorded in medical or county records. The size and construction of the cabin suggested a standard of living somewhat higher than typical for remote hollows. Archaeological evidence indicated that despite their isolation, the family had occasionally obtained manufactured goods, likely through trading moonshine and coal they mined from a small seam on their property. Most poignantly, the team discovered a small family cemetery on the ridge above the cabin. Among the weathered stones were 2 tiny markers side by side, hand-carved with only initials SB and SB. Samuel Jr. and Suddy Blackwood, the twins who had been removed from the hollow, but whose memory had been honored by those who remained. The archaeological findings attracted attention beyond academic circles. Local media covered the excavation, often framing it as a rediscovery of a legendary mountain family. These reports reached members of the extended Blackwood family, many of whom had never known the details of their ancestry or its scientific significance. In October 2002, a remarkable gathering took place at the site. Descendants of various branches of the Blackwood family, some from as far away as California and Florida, came to see where their ancestors had lived and learn about the family's unique place in medical history. Among them was Eleanor's youngest daughter, Mary Johnson Taylor, then 62, who had grown up knowing fragments of her mother's story, but never the full context. "Standing where my mother lived, seeing how isolated it was even today, I understand better why things happened as they did," Mary told reporters. This wasn't about ignorance or backward ways. It was about survival in a place where choices were severely limited. The family gathering became the catalyst for the Black Mountain Genetic Heritage Project, a community-based initiative that transformed the painful legacy of the Blackwoods into an educational resource with support from the University of Kentucky and the CDC. The project developed programs for schools, health care providers, and community groups throughout Appalachia. Dr. Sarah Williams, a geneticist who led the scientific component of the project, emphasized the broader relevance of the Blackwood story. What happened in this hollow isn't just Appalachian history, it's human history. Throughout the world, isolated populations face similar genetic challenges. The Blackwood case helps us understand these processes and develop appropriate interventions that respect cultural sensitivities while promoting health. The project's most significant achievement was the establishment of the Eleanor Blackwood Johnson Center for Genetic Education in Harlem in 2005. The center provides free genetic counseling, carrier testing, and educational resources to Appalachian families. Its founding principle, inspired by Eleanor's own words, is that knowledge rather than shame is the appropriate response to genetic health challenges. Mary Johnson Taylor became the center's first community liaison, sharing her mother's story with a compassion and clarity that resonated with local residents. "My mother carried guilt her entire life for something she didn't understand when it happened," Mary explained during the center's opening ceremony. "No one should have to bear that kind of burden. With the science we have today, we can prevent suffering rather than just witness it." As genetic science advanced through the early 21st century, researchers continued to make discoveries relevant to the Blackwood lineage. In 2010, a team from the National Human Genome Research Institute identified a specific genetic variant present in many descendants of Appalachian families with histories of consanguinity. This variant, nicknamed the founder effect variant, helped explain why certain recessive disorders appeared with unusual frequency in these populations. Even generations after outbreeding began, testing revealed that approximately 1 in 15 people with ancestry from eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, and parts of West Virginia carried this variant, a living testament to how profoundly past isolation had shaped the region's genetic landscape. Most carriers would never experience any symptoms themselves, but the knowledge allowed for informed reproductive choices. In 2018, the hollow where the Blackwood homestead once stood was designated a National Historic Site, recognized for its significance to medical history and Appalachian cultural heritage. A small museum near the trailhead tells the family's story, neither sensationalizing nor minimizing the consequences of their isolation. Visitors can hike to the homestead site, now marked with interpretive signs that explain both the historical context and scientific understanding of what occurred there. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of the Blackwood story is how it transformed from whispered scandal to valued knowledge. In communities throughout Appalachia, family histories once hidden are now discussed openly as part of genetic health awareness. Young people learn about the region's unique heritage, including how geographic isolation shaped both culture and genetics. The final entry in the Blackwood narrative came in 2021 when Mary Johnson Taylor, at age 81, published My Mother's Mountain, a memoir combining family history with reflections on how science helped bring understanding to tragedy. In the book's conclusion, she wrote, "The curse that my grandmother Martha believed had fallen on our family wasn't supernatural. It was the natural consequence of isolation and limited knowledge. What once seemed like fate, we now understand as genetics. What was hidden in shame, we now discuss openly as health." The shadow that fell across Black Mountain for generations has lifted, not through forgetting our past, but by bringing it into the light of understanding. Today, the Black Mountain Ridge stands much as it did when the Blackwoods first settled there 2 centuries ago. The forest has reclaimed the hollow, covering most traces of human habitation. But the legacy of what happened there continues not as a curse, but as knowledge that has prevented countless similar tragedies and brought healing to a region long burdened by misunderstood history. Eleanor Blackwood's journey from the isolated hollow to becoming unknowingly a pioneer in genetic education reminds us that even the darkest family histories can ultimately serve the cause of human understanding and compassion. If you've watched all the way through this powerful journey into America's hidden history, leave a comment saying, "I watched it all," so I can get to know who truly appreciates these untold stories from our past. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. These forgotten chapters of American history revealed truths about our society that deserve to be understood rather than whispered. Like and share this video to help others discover how science can bring understanding to even the most isolated communities and family histories.